This paper that we're going to present now is work that's been funded by the British Academy and the League of Human Trust. It's a project that Paul and I have had running over the last 2 years, and it is a substantive paper. It's not supposed to necessarily set up themes for the Sheffield workshop, but I think it does raise a number of issues that we would like to explore in the Sheffield workshop, and obviously in the discussion after the paper. So the paper is on employment protection legislation, looking at trends, causes and consequences since the start of the crisis. And the reconstruction of labour markets and labour market regulation is clearly an important theme in the post-crisis landscape. It's key, or one of the key measures that are intended to kickstart growth, pursuing greater flexibility in the labour market, empowering employers in the hope that this somehow will aid the restoration of competitiveness and restart accumulation. And it also, the issues we're going to speak about here, they connect with a number of the issues that Paul mentioned at the beginning. In particular, the importance of ideas, and we are, in the course of this paper, going to look at the way in which the idea that labour market flexibility is an important prerequisite for competitiveness has gained even greater traction since the start of the economic crisis. And we're also going to look at issues relating to actors and strategies, and thinking about the kind of multi-scalar nature of the post-crisis reconstruction of labour markets, and the way new actors, in particular the European Central Bank, but also established actors such as the IMF and the European Commission, have been able to deepen their involvement in the organisation of national labour market policies and the content of national labour market policies. So there's a key debate here in regard to employment protection legislation, which we are going to start the paper by looking at. There's, if you like, one side which argues that weaker employment protection legislation will be beneficial to the economies of Europe. It will encourage a hiring spree and thus reduce unemployment. And there's the sceptical side, and I think we place ourselves among the skeptics, who will doubt that the current wave of employment reforms, labour market reforms, are going to stimulate an increase in decent, high-quality jobs or substantially improve the competitiveness of the EU economies. So, for those of you who don't know what employment protection legislation is, it's not employment rights in toto. It's specifically employment rights that relate to hiring and individual and collective dismissals, and in particular the dismissals aspect of that, and regulations relating to the use of temporary contracts. How free are employers to dismiss labour? How free are employers to make use of temporary contracts? So employment protection legislation, or EPL for short, sets limits to employers' ability to dismiss employees and provides workers with rights in respect of consultation and severance payments. And as far as the OECD economies are concerned, there is a set of measures which the OECD has developed, which are designed to measure the strength of individual and collective employment protections, and also regulations relating to temporary contracts across the OECD. These measures basically look at the difficulty, expense and risk for employers in dismissing individual permanent workers or individual workers on permanent contracts, process the dismissals, the notice period, and the cost of collective dismissals, and the use of creation, permitted duration and degree of equal treatment of temporary workers relative to those on regular contracts. So, it's a long-standing debate, this idea that weaker employment protection legislation is beneficial to economies. This is not a new debate, but it's a debate that has gained in potency, if you like, or a set of arguments that have gained in potency since the start of the economic crisis, and are certainly influencing the shape of the IMF, European Commission's and European Central Bank's prescriptions for labour market reform post-crisis. The case against strong employment protection legislation is firstly that it creates labour market rigidity. It's seen as an unhelpful labour institution that interferes with market mechanisms in the labour market and contributes to labour market rigidity. And it increases hiring costs because employers take into account the potential costs of dismissal when making their initial hiring decisions. So they factor in, if you like, dismissal costs, and that suppresses the overall rate of employment. A slight tweak on this is that employment protection legislation, particularly for workers on regular contracts, creates an insider-outsider divide whereby disadvantaged workers, young workers, the unemployed, workers on temporary contracts, find it harder to compete for regular positions, and insiders are relatively insulated, relatively protected from competition from outsiders. Consequently, their wages are higher than they would otherwise be if employment protections were lower. So the policy prescription that flows from that is if you weaken employment protections for those in regular contracts, that has a downward effect on the wages, and so-called outsiders are more easily able to compete for decent jobs. So lower employment protection legislation should help to lessen the insider-outsider divide. But there is a case for, which I won't go through in detail, but the basic idea here is that employment protection legislation, to the extent that it provides for job security and underpins kind of high trust employment relations and reduces labour turnover and encourages long tenure, in turn makes employers more confident in making investments in skills, encourages cooperation between labour and management in a kind of change management context or a context of technological innovation, because workers do not fear the implementation of new products and processes. New technologies are going to threaten their jobs, and overall then this contributes to productivity growth. Now it's fair to say that the evidence on this is highly mixed indeed. There are some studies which find that relatively strict employment protection legislation does have a negative effect on employment. There are other studies that find that it has a positive effect on employment. There are a number of other studies, possibly the majority, that find that the impact of EPL, when you control for other things, is broadly neutral. In other words, there's not a lot going on there. Well, even if that's the case in relation to aggregate employment and unemployment, it's still possible, because of these kind of insider-outsider effects, that certain groups of workers are nevertheless disadvantaged by employment protection legislation, and the focus here has been on young workers in particular. But again, the empirical evidence suggests that it's a very mixed picture. Some studies finding for, some studies finding against, and a very good, slightly dated now, but a very good overview by Dean Baker and colleagues from the mid-2000s reviewed all the studies that have been produced to date then, and found that much depends on the time periods we're looking at, the estimation methods, the model, the measures. So the court is still out. On balance, it's probably fair to say that the empirical evidence, if you take it as a whole, on balance, the empirical evidence does tend to suggest that employment protection legislation is positively associated with productivity growth, and those productivity benefits may serve to outweigh any potential negative impact that employment protection legislation might have on employment. Positive findings for skills development, again, by reducing turnover, by increasing tenure, by contributing to employment stability. It seems that employment protection legislation is associated with relatively higher levels of investment in skill formation than in countries with lower employment protection legislation. And I won't labour it, but again, on products and process innovations, EPL seems to be to have a contributing impact in that regard. Okay. Now, despite the fact that the evidence suggests that there's no clear-cut relationship between employment protection legislation and employment, policymakers haven't tended to see it that way. And within the European Commission and the European Central Bank, there has been this tendency to be highly sceptical about the impact of the employment protection legislation on the labour market. But the argument has particularly gained force since the crisis. In the 20 to 30 year period leading up to the crisis, we can think in terms of kind of three stages, three periods. The emphasis placed on labour market flexibility has varied across those three periods. In the initial period of the 80s and 90s, the focus was really on European integration, the creation of the single market and single currency, and the idea that that should be accompanied by underpinning social rights. So there was an emphasis then on social protections, European social directives relating to such things as working time. But nevertheless, the Commission was supporting partial labour market deregulation, particularly with regard to temporary workers. The argument here was that the European member states should encourage employment by deregulating at the margins and enabling employers to make more use of temporary contracts. Now, these issues of labour market flexibility and the extent to which you encourage temporary employment really started to become even more important, more prominent in European policy debates after the Amsterdam Treaty and the launch of the European Employment Strategy, and particularly consolidated after the relaunch of the Lisbon Strategy in 2005, when the issues of jobs and competitiveness were really placed at the centre. And from that point on, you get a greater concern at the level of the European Commission with the deregulation of regular employment, so increasing labour market flexibility by reducing employment protection legislation for regular workers on regular contracts, standard contracts, as well as those on temporary contracts. And this was couched in the kind of language of flex security, the idea that you should promote reliable but flexible contracts while still ensuring that there's a certain element of security for workers through such things as active labour market measures, modern, I think there's a term that is modern and sustainable welfare, social protection systems, and lifelong learning. So an emphasis on the supply side, an emphasis on lifelong learning in particular, reflecting the belief that workers can somehow kind of train themselves back into employment. So the emphasis was on enhancing employment security through enhancing employability through lifelong learning, rather than enhancing job security. From the Commission's point of view, job security was a thing of the past. Can't guarantee job security because of the kind of asocial forces of new technology and globalisation. It means that job security can no longer be achieved according to the Commission. So the emphasis should be on employability and employment security instead. But of course that becomes even more problematic in the context of the crisis. This notion that workers can be activated back into employment and trained back into employment becomes increasingly problematic when there are no jobs for them to actually access them, or a decreasing supply of decent jobs. And we've also seen since 2008 as well a hardening of the position of the European Commission in relation to employment protection legislation. During the kind of flex security period, the Commission was kind of ambiguous. Sometimes it seemed to be arguing for greater flexibility, sometimes not. Sometimes it argued that weaker employment protection legislation was important, but sometimes not. It kind of depended on the political circumstances. When it was trying to sell the flex security notion, some member states, the Civic Trade Union movement across Europe, was very concerned about the potential implications of that for workers' rights, so hence they were downplayed. But since the crisis, they've been amplified. Those issues have been amplified. Right, so by 2008, we're going to look at the post-2008 situation in just a second. But by 2008, basically what you've got across Europe is this. It looks a bit like kids getting compliant. It actually isn't. It's a spread of EPL scores, okay? Remember, going back a few slides, I said the OECD measures different dimensions of employment protection legislation. What it does on a scale that runs from 0 to 6, and this is kind of composite. So here's the employment protection legislation scale up here, okay? Countries with stronger employment protection legislation scoring more highly than those with lower employment protection legislation. And what you see, if you look at the OECD scores, across the period 1990 to 2008 is a compression of the scores, much of that driven in the deregulation of temporary employment. Okay? You probably can't see it from there, but that's the UK. You know, despite the coalition government arguing there's too much bureaucracy, employers are shackled, they can't hire anyone because of employment rights and so forth. There's the UK bubbling under nicely, just about there. The USA, Matt's interest in particular, the USA would be flatlining there, okay, at 0.5. There's the UK. Okay? So a compression of employment protection legislation scores. And by 2008, then we could think in terms of a group of countries with relatively low employment protection legislation scores, which would include Denmark, Ireland, Sweden, and the UK. A set of countries with, if you like, medium scores, Austria, Belgium, Finland, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, and a set of countries with relatively high scores, France, Greece, Luxembourg, Portugal, and Spain. And much of the changes since 2008 are concentrated in the high EPL group, but not entirely. There have been changes that have affected, for example, the UK and Melanie Sims, for example. IR researchers from the UK will know all about the changes the coalition government have been making in relation to unfair dismissal legislation and so-called employee ownership scheme, and changes to the employment tribunal system and so forth, all of which have affected employment rights and employment protections in the UK in a negative way, in a deleterious way. But much of the change is concentrated on the high group, because these are countries that have experienced financial distress since the start of the crisis. And they're countries that have been subject to special measures, as it were, and have introduced reforms at the behest of the so-called Troika of the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF. But they're not the only countries that are making reforms as a consequence of requests from, as it were, from the European Commission and the ECB and the IMF. More broadly, the European Commission has put in place a set of country-specific recommendations which are renewed on an annual basis, which relate to various economic and social policy issues, including employment law reform. And it's not just the financially distressed countries that have been advised or instructed to make changes, although it's because of the situation, because they are countries that have received financial assistance from the European Commission, like the ECB and the IMF. Those are countries which have been most obliged to make changes, but even countries such as Netherlands and Belgium have been encouraged, should we say, to make reforms and weaken their employment protection legislation. So we have a set of countries, most of which have received financial assistance of some kind from the Troika, either in the form of bailouts or intervention in bond markets. They include Spain, Portugal, Italy, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Lithuania, Czech Republic, which is an exception, to the UK, which is also an exception, but all of them have diluted their employment protection legislation. No need to go through the specific changes because they do vary country to country depending on its circumstances. But the reforms in general have included an extension of probation periods, thus extending the amount of time the employee has to work before they can claim unfair dismissal. There were reductions in severance pay, redundancy payments, in other words, and compensation for unfair dismissals, a weakening of trade unions' consultation rights, and increasing employees' freedom to determine the criteria for dismissal, that is, to decide who is and who is not to be dismissed. Now, in the second part of the paper, we'd like to go on and start considering, is this necessarily a good thing? And is this going to contribute to a revival in the fortunes of these economies and an improvement in employment and the quality of jobs? And we're going to suggest that the answer to that is no. And there's a danger here of neglecting the positive benefits, positive impacts of employment protection legislation. The first thing to consider is that employment protection legislation acts in a sense like an automatic stabilizer in downturns. It cushions the effects of economic crises on the labour market. And you can see this if you look at the most recent crisis. EPL did have a cushioning effect, particularly where it was combined with short-time working programs. So these are programs which enable employers to reduce hours of work as an adjustment mechanism rather than dismissing workers as an adjustment mechanism. So it's about, as it were, internal flexibility rather than external flexibility. And you see in countries like Germany and Austria, some Scandinavian countries too, I think Sweden, but certainly Germany and Austria anyway, the emphasis was on achieving adjustments, achieving reductions in labour costs through short-time working measures. And Germany has been seen as the particular success story in this regard. At the peak of the crisis, there were 1.5 million workers involved in short-time working measures in Germany. Now, that's 1.5 million workers that would otherwise have been unemployed. And this is why, if you look at the period since 2008, despite the fact that Germany suffered a very large output shock in 2008-2009, a reduction of 5% of GDP, unemployment didn't go up. I don't think it went up at all, in fact. These workers were insulated through short-time working measures, which were in turn were incentivised through relatively robust employment protection legislation in the German case. It incentivises employers to try to keep workers on books rather than dismiss them, because dismissing them is relatively costly. It's cheaper to keep them on books. And of course, these workers are then available as economies go into the upswing and enables employers to increase production without having to go through the whole kind of hiring and retraining cycle. They've got the capacity there already. So if we just look at a couple of slides, I don't want to read too much into this. First of all, I'll explain what it shows. What we've got up here on this axis is change in employment rate between the third quarter of 2008 and the third quarter of 2009, so the first year of the crisis, basically, depending on what you want to use as a start date, but we're going to use September 2008. Okay, thank you. And along here we've got the OECD employment protection legislation measure. And what it shows is there's a relatively positive association. Those countries with relatively robust employment protection legislation, at least in the initial period, were less likely to suffer a reduction in the employment rate than those countries with weaker employment protection legislation. Okay? It's obviously not a perfect correlation, but it is a relationship nevertheless. Over the longer period, however, when austerity starts to kick in and public sector job cuts start to kick in, and employers, even in those countries that are relatively highly regulated, have the time to make adjustments, that positive relationship disappears. But what you end up with is, a relationship which is not statistically significant. It suggests that actually employment protection legislation is not doing much with regard to the employment rate across the longer period. In other words, again, potentially its effects are relatively neutral. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Paul now, who's going to look at what's happened to unemployment in those countries that have cut EPL.
Thanks, Jason. I just wanted to quickly show you a few illustrative bits of evidence, and then I'll sum up and open it to some comments. So broadly, if we look at how these changes were supposed to perform, so they're supposed to increase employment generally, decrease unemployment. They're supposed to bring outsiders in the sense of outsiders being young workers or long-term unemployed workers. There's very little evidence that any of the changes that have occurred have actually had any effect whatsoever on these measures. So we look at long-term unemployment, the trend, pretty much stable from Q1 2008 upwards still. We don't know what the counterfactual would have been if none of these changes had been made, but even so, it looks as though there's no noticeable point at which EPL is being diluted and there's some change in the unemployment data. Similarly, we look at youth unemployment. Again, we've got a very similar trend across the range of European countries going upwards. which kind of brings us on to an area that we've looked at in particular, is looking at what young workers have been doing. So where has the growth in youth employment occurred? And to be honest, that paints an even bleaker picture than the aggregate data. So we looked at what's been happening with youth employment both prior to the crisis and after the crisis. And prior to the crisis, you see the effects of some of the changes in employment protection legislation that were occurring much earlier, and also some of the effects of changes in employment generally. So what we've seen is basically growth in lower skilled occupations. We've seen contraction in traditional sectors. We see very clearly substitution from permanent to temporary contracts, from full-time to part-time. We see higher educated workers being substituted for lower educated. And then you see the crisis as a kind of punctuation point, and things turn very bad after that. But these broad trends that were there before, continuing afterwards. So I'll show you a couple of illustrative slides of that. So what this is showing, perhaps a bit busy for the presentation, these are broad occupational groups as defined internationally, and the different bars show the change in type of employment for young workers. So it's yellow is change in part-time, blue and purple change in permanent, change in full-time, green is changing temporary, and then we've got another category that's self and family employed. Basically what you see is you've got contractions in full-time and permanent work for clerks and for craft and related workers in large numbers, and for plant and machine operators in large numbers. And where you've got growth broadly across the piece, it's always in temporary, or largely in temporary, largely in part-time. And it's dominated in particular by service and sales workers, which is retail, hospitality. You also see some growth here in elementary occupations. They're the lowest skill level of the ISCO codes that we're looking at. It's not a particularly rosy picture, and this is before the crisis. Okay, I'll jump to, and this is it split by the educational background of young workers. It's not by occupation now, it's just by type of work. So if it was bad to be young, it was worse to be low educated and young, is what this was saying prior to the crisis. This grey colour is the lowest educated group who've finished lower secondary education. Orange is medium educated, so they finished high school education up to 18, and then blue is high educated, which is degree or equivalent qualifications. And what you see is basically, if you are low educated, you've lost an awful lot of employment was lost in both permanent and full-time work, and net a lot of jobs for low educated workers were lost. You've got growth for the other two educational categories, but the only group that were growing full-time and permanent work were the highest educated. So then jumping to after the crisis, as you might expect, you see basically the collapse in demand effect. So you've got job losses across every category virtually. The only group who pretty much sustained their employment was the highest educated. There was no net change virtually for the highest educated across, at least across the EU15. Everywhere else it was large-scale contraction. Look at that by occupation. As you might expect, all very, very negative. The only areas that have been growing since the crisis is that service and sales workers category. And that's been, there has actually been some growth, decently again, part-time, temporary. And interestingly, in professionals, as far as we understand it, I mean, we've tried to get to the bottom of what is causing this bit of growth here in professionals. It's occurring in the UK and it's occurring in Germany, but the data that we've got from the EU Labour Force Survey isn't good enough to tell us exactly what it's saying. We're going to have to go to some other data sets for that. So we don't exactly understand this, but it's not a pretty picture. So to wrap this up, so I'm aware that we've used our privilege a little bit. Jason talked about the changes in employment protection legislation, the changes in ideas that are behind those. We've also seen, since the crisis, this emphasis is, if the emphasis was on flexicurity before, or for a little while was on flexicurity, the spending that's been available for the active labour market policies for the security part has been slashed. And so it really is an emphasis now on the flexibility part, not on the security part. You can see that again in another chart showing spending on active labour market measures falling downwards. So to conclude, our argument, and obviously we can elaborate this a bit better in the paper, is that there has been both an ideational shift and an institutional shift in that certain actors, supranational institutions within the EU, have been pushing for flexicurity, or flexibility I should say, since the crisis. The ideas are certainly not new, they get cycled around every so often, but the force with which they're being enacted now, both in a coercive manner, but also voluntarily by certain countries, because it's part of a competitiveness narrative, is fairly rapid, to say the least. And the consequences of this, there's very little evidence that it's working on its own terms. And looking at what's happening with things like youth employment, there's a fair amount of evidence that there's considerable damage that can be caused by unravelling these things in the way that it's being done. So we think that the very unclear benefits, and there's some quite clear costs, and that the issues of job quality and the enduring problem of underemployment are not being solved by reducing employment protections across member states of the EU. Thanks very much. Thank you. We have some comments from Matt.
Yeah, thanks Paul, thanks Jason. I did get the paper ahead of time, and I did see these slides, so I have prepared some remarks in response to this a little bit. Okay, so let me start. In terms of the empirics, I mean, I think this is important stuff, and I think it's hard to disagree with any of these. It's a pretty straightforward case you make that these changes to employment protection legislation don't seem to have a more or less neutral effect on the outcomes they're talking about. What I want to do is raise some questions, talk about some questions that are raised by this analysis. I've got 6 of them. Let's see if I can get through them. Let me start by noting I should say thanks to Paul for making this so easy for me. He sets this up in terms of dominant ideas, sets up the whole thing in terms of dominant ideas, influential actors, and strategic action, and there's no structure in there. So I'll talk about structure. I'll talk about economic structure, I'll talk about economic institutions and how these ideas are related to changes in the economy over the 20th century. So that's going to be my emphasis, is more on a structural analysis. But I am going to talk about ideas and actors. So the first question, just to kind of start things off, maybe a bit provocatively, is does the evidence matter in these policy debates? In your paper, you start off by saying we're going to subject policymakers' faith in deregulation to critical scrutiny. And then the entirety of your paper acts as if this is a really crucial thing. If we can get the evidence right, then there might be some response by policymakers. I think you undercut your own argument in a certain sense by you cite the Quiggin book in the paper, which basically shows that these ideas, this about zombie, what's the title of the book?
Zombie economics.
Zombie economics. These ideas never die, and I'm going to talk about this flow of ideas in my there's another book. You also cited Jamie Peck's paper on Beyond Employability, which I might talk about a little bit. And there's another one related to that, which is Gordon Laffer's book called The Job Training Charade. He's a sociologist from the University of Oregon. And he was looking at this stuff right when it came out under Clinton, because this stuff comes out first under Clinton in the 1990s, and then Blair, obviously following Clinton. And Gordon has a whole book on it, Gordon Laffer, where he shows that this stuff, that there's ample evidence that these job training programs, these supply side programs, don't have any intended effect. And policymakers have even seen this. But it doesn't change the policy. So this raises the question, right? It seems very ideological to me, and it seems like if we want to talk, we need to have an explanation for why these ideas keep returning, even though they should have died long ago. So the ideas. So what's the long term of the ideas? Well, over the 20th century, liberalism was the dominant idea within economic policy until the Great Depression, and then it was more or less completely discredited after the Great Depression. And that's when you have you have all of the economies across the OECD turn to extensive use of protectionism, capital controls, and these financiers, the liberal bankers and financiers, they really lost out in this, and the Keynesians, and the coalition of Keynesians and others got together, and they had some real effect on the economy, on policy, and there was actually a shift in policy until the crisis of what we might call the crisis of Fordism in the 1970s, which is declining profit rates, declining productivity rates, rising economic stagnation, inflation, stagflation. Then you get the liberals now are neoliberals, and they've been pushing these ideas ever since. And in the 1970s, you get a lot of the precursors of this, like the rise of shareholder value, efficient markets hypothesis. And then when it comes to these questions about work, you get the supply side training only active labor market policy, really, in the 80s in the US, and then in the 90s in the UK, and then in the aughts in Europe. Now, then you have the crisis. So this is the financial crisis of 2007-8, and neoliberalism seems to have emerged unscathed. So this is a serious question. Why did the Great Depression have such an effect on policy ideas, but this one didn't? This last crisis didn't. I'm going to come back. I'm going to try and end on that. I'm going to leave that hanging and come back. But I think that's a key question raised. Okay, so the first point. So does the evidence matter? The evidence doesn't seem to matter that much for policy, so it seems like a very ideological battle to me. So let's try and figure out what the point of that ideological battle, or how to conceptualize the ideological battle. Second point. Second question. Does any of this deregulation in the labor market have anything to do with the 2007 financial crisis? It's framed that way in your paper, it's framed that way in this conference. I'm not convinced. I mean, you guys make a case that it's been hardened, in a sense. This emphasis on employment protection legislation has been hardened since the crisis. I'm not sure if it was. Labor market policy has been, labor market flexibility has been core neoliberal policy since Reagan and Thatcher. It's evolved it's evolved and developed over time, and you don't get, and it's happened later at the European level. But these ideas existed, as I suggested earlier. I mean, they start out in the early 90s. I guess it wasn't in the 80s, but it was in the early 90s under Clinton, where this welfare to workers pioneered. And then Blair adopts it, and then so it's just a matter of timing. It's basically the same thing. It was full on. It was the policy of the EU throughout the 2000s, since before the crisis. I don't see much new here. I don't know how important this point is, whether it's even that important of a point, but it did seem like there's an open question about whether anything has changed other than maybe, I mean, it seems to me that the policy serves basically as a means for the people who are already pushing these policies to simply reassert them with more emphasis. In a sense, I'm going to get into a sort of class analysis here, but in a sense, there's underlying this shift again in thinking in the long term, the broad 20th century. There's been a shift in power from labor to capital since the 1970s. In many ways, it's been affected through deunionization and outsourcing and the mobile capital versus rooted labor thing. And it just seems to me like it possibly took a little bit longer for it to fill. It was ready to happen in the US and the UK, and then it took a little bit longer for these elites, these financial elites, and their supporters to get control of Europe through the Troika. But it seems pretty clearly that now this is a question that I have, which I don't know because I'm not an EU specialist, but I'm wondering is there real, if there are labor, there does seem to be within Europe more representation of labor and left interests than you get in the UK and the US, and I wonder if underneath this, are there some real attempts to actually implement policies that have to do with employment security and integration? From the level of the Troika, it seems pretty clear that these global financial interests dominate. And I'm going to come back to this in my next question on the goals of policy. But so that's just a question. I think this is probably less important one. How much does the crisis have to do with it? Third question: is there anything new to this policy at all that's different from the old policy? I think there is one thing. And I get this from Jamie Peck's paper on employability, and I think he's what you guys cite in your paper. The thing that makes neoliberalism new is that it's an attempt to explicitly use the state to ensure that the conditions in which markets operate and as at the core of the economy. The old liberalism just was laissez-faire, just said let it do it on itself, and now there's a recognition that the state has to ensure the conditions of proper market functioning. So, at one level, there's not anything new. It's just it's a continued focus on the continued liberal focus on the individual level of analysis. The problems with any labor market problems with unemployment are problems of individuals. So the solution should be focused on individuals. The one new thing, and there might be a silver lining in this. Again, I get this from Jamie Peck, is that there's now an emphasis. It's not just that labor market unemployment happens because people are lazy or unmotivated, but there is a recognition that there's some need that it's hard to acquire skills in this economy, and the right skills in the right time. So there is a recognition of dynamism in the economy, and there's some role for the state in trying to help individuals get the right skill set for this economy. So that's maybe something that can be built on in terms of trying to develop a better approach. But more or less, there's more continuity than anything in terms of this liberal policy of focusing on the labor market as just an issue of individual workers, and not problems of structural demand in the economy, what kind of jobs the economy is creating. So I see this all just as basically, if you're from a labor perspective, or if you're trying to defend the European social model, it's an ongoing fight against neoliberalism. Fourth question: why these ideas now? Again, I see these ideas largely as continuous with liberalism, with the added changed, that there's a recognition that the state has to help foster the conditions of functional markets. But I think that we need to go, I mean, to properly understand these problems, I think we need to go back to understand the development. Magnus said he was a little bit comfortable with stage models, but I'm going to propose a stage model here. I think stage models
If it's
are...
the right one, it's no problem.
I mean, I think stage models are important because, and this is going to get me back to my original question I posed about why the Depression, the Great Depression, had an effect on which ideas were dominant in policy, but this latest crisis didn't. I think we need to understand, and this gets to structure and institutions. I think we need to understand the development of the economy through various institutional settlements. I talk about it in terms of growth regimes, regulation theory stuff. And I think if we look at the development of capitalism this way, it seems very clear that if we call the period from 1945 to about 1970 the Fordist period, or whatever name you choose, this was a very unique period in the history of capitalism, and one that's not going to return. And it was in this period where you had rising profits and rising real wages and rising living standards across the board. So there was a sense in which in this institutional settlement you could have a positive sum gain between profits and wages, and you didn't, and you had a whole different set of issues for labor markets because so what was this Fordist period? It was a manufacturing-based economy with oligopolistic competition among vertically integrated firms producing for domestic markets. This is the core, or the organizational core of it. At the end, because of that, because they were focused on domestic markets, there was very little head-to-head international trade, and that allowed oligopoly in the core of the economy, which allowed a class compromise to happen. So you could have these class compromises which were established through national level bargaining, or in the U.S. pattern bargaining, starting with the auto sector. You could have wages taken out of competition at the national level. And then, of course, the Bretton Woods international system, which allowed national policy autonomy, which allowed these varieties of capitalism to bloom and to take different paths. All of that's gone now. And once